Hello, hello. Shall we start the class? Rasmita Gadai. Hello, Rasmita Gadai. It's not responding. Hello, Rasmita Gadai. Do you hear me? Anyway, so in the last class, we are discussing about metal and mineral resources. Uh, so today we'll learn about the conservation, uh, conservation through ages, I think. Or sorry, man-nature relationship. Have I discussed it in the last class? Annapurna Samal.
Yes, sir.
uh, have we discussed this man-nature relationship and conservation through ages in the last class?
सर लास्ट क्लास में ज्वाइन करना थी.
Okay. So anyway, let me start with that, and we'll proceed further. So since ancient past, there was the concern for environment. Yes, I have finished this. I think I have finished this chapter. So let's proceed for understanding of environment. Colonialism in the particularly in the colonial context, colonialism is generally considered an environmental turning point in the history of India. An era of unprecedented resource exploitation begins, and natural resources get geared to the requirements of the nascent in English industries. The commercial interests come center stage, and a large chunk of communities dependent on various resource use practices for their subsistence, and they were marginalized. The twin process of industrialization and colonialization operate in tandem and bring an environmental impoverishment for India. The colonial power in this process is guided by its own understanding of the environment of the colony, and the policy of resource use unfolds and becomes operational in consequence with this understanding. So let us know what is industrial. industrialism and how it uh, helped or how it involved in environmental discourse. Industrial revolution, as we know, it started in Europe first, and it was a momentous occurrence. It signaled a break for the biological regimes and initiated a process for industrialization, and that was impregnated with enormous new possibilities of the use of natural resources. Industrialization was accompanied by technological advances for technological advances for the development of industries. So in fact, until the 18th century, a jungle book could have been written about almost any part of the globe. So England was pioneering industrialization. As it is said that industrialization first started in England first. So it was the special circumstances that had given England a position of eminence. Industrialization was a complex process, as we know, that had got initiated there due to a peculiar combination of factors, particularly the environmental factors. The major areas that had come under the spots of industrialization were agriculture, demography, inland transport, technology, trade, and industry. In fact, there was no sector of private or public life in England that was actually immune from industrialization. And understanding of industrialization uh, uh, and its formulation of environmental perception of English colonizers. Agriculture provided the necessary backdrop against the industrial changes unfolded. Experiments with soil usage and the introduction of a variety of crops was perhaps the first stage where notable changes became evident. The fertilizing properties of soil were enhanced by liming and marling the soil. That is the adjusting the right mix of clay and lime in the soil, and a pattern of crop rotation experimented for rejuvenating the different layers of soil. These practices were being done in order to increase the fertility of the soil. So it's an interesting fact that industrial and mechanized equipment in agriculture were introduced only around mid 19th century. So Braudel notes that changes in agriculture comes not so much from machines or wonder crops as from new methods of land use, new timetables for plowing, new forms of crop rotation, which eliminated fallow and encouraged grazing, a useful source of fertilizer and therefore a remedy for soil exhaustion, attention to new strains of crops, selective breeding of sheep and cattle, and all these things. So, one of the early changes in the industrial sector was the introduction of coke in as fuel, replacing charcoal. The most noticeable use of coke was in blast furnaces for making pig iron. In about 1760, the cost price of charcoal fired smelting was about £2 per ton, greater than that of iron produced by the rival method. The coke fired blast furnaces, the other significant change in the cotton sector where a production boom began to slowly to show by the close of 18th century. Here India was directly involved in it. An extraordinary expansion of English trade was one more feature of industrialization. After 1760, the English overseas trade continuously increased. Why it is so? It was because the colonies that were developed by England in different parts of the world, and India was among one among them. After 1757, after the Battle of Plassey, India could, sorry, the British established their rule in India, and the center gravity of this, and after that the trade movement in India increased. The center of gravity for this trade moved towards American colonies and of course India. Significantly, this success in most cases was achieved by force, not by persuasion. In case of wars, or by force. Alongside this came improvements in land transport. The canal fever, as the development of navigable waterways, is generally known as began in 1775, and by 1830s, wide and narrow canals had crisscrossed the entire country. The main intent was to facilitate resources on a ball scale so that growth of English industries would not be shifted for want of natural resources in the proximity of the sites of the industries. These details point towards two conclusions. First, in the first place, we find that industrialization resulted in into a good deal of destruction, adaptation, and a reconstruction, restructuring. The traditional structure of agriculture were impaired, and the land use patterns changed significantly by the coming of these modern techniques. For instance, animal farming became more profitable and arable, making farmers to shift uh, to forage crops. So these were being done. Since forage crops do based on light and sandy soils, these became the most productive land in England. Heavy clay soils, by contrast, previously regarded as the richest for cereal growing and unsuitable for forage crops. So, and these were hit by the low prices created by the higher yields in rival regions. The central discourse under industrialization was about the revolution in the mode of resource use, transforming the resources from one form to another and making it possible for resources from resources to be transported over long distances away from the places of their origin. Evidently, environmental perception or understanding of the English colonizers was mediated by this discourse. In the English understanding of environmental condition in India in 18th century, but especially since the Battle of Plassey, following features were quite dominant. The natural resources of India needed to be elevated to the level of commercial use in place of prevalent general practice of use for subsistence purposes. Second, the resource use practices and needed to become free from restraints so as to enable resource exploitation. Then let us know the colonialism and environmental discourse as it is continuing on. Colonization of India was an occurrence of singular significance. The largest colony in the world was created by classic capitalist power. The long historical process from about the middle of the 18th century till the beginning of 20th century was fought with devices of resource exploitation of an unprecedented kind, interceded by an environmental perception that oriented resources principally towards the market. Then the English colonial control in India began with the acquisition of power to collect land revenue, and that was started in India in 1765 with the accepting of Diwani rights of Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. What seemed on the face of a simple political process had grave and quite far-reaching implications. Irfan Habib describes the process and its meaning exquisitely. He said that the East India Company, which obtained this power, was controlled by the great merchant capitalists of London. Actually, the then colonial India was being ruled by a board of directors which was situated in London. These merchants in India were directed and instructed by the board of directors there, sitting there. These merchants had so far conducted a trade based on the import of Indian piece goods, that is muslin, calico, cheese, silk, indigo, spices, and all these things. So that was financed mainly by the export of treasure. Now suddenly they found in their conquests the ultimate bliss that every merchant dreams of to be able to buy without having to pay, and yet be able to sell at the full price. They purchase the material, they purchase the goods from India very at a very less rate, or even free. So, and they sold it in their market, in European market, at a heavy price. And by this, they could get huge profit out of that. Interestingly, the profits so gained by English did not come from commerce, but were made available through the collection of land revenue. Thus, if the profits had to be increased, in the land revenue too needed to be enhanced. A great pressure was exerted on the farmers. Why it was so? It is because the profits uh, that was expected from trade were taken away, or were utilized by the traders, private English traders, or particularly the East India Company traders. They took away all the profits and they were not paying it to the government in England. So that was the problem. So the government thought that the only way to get any kind of any kind of profit is that comes from revenue. So now they increased the land revenue, which was pressure on the farmers. The results were terrifying, as the agriculture was ruined. Because you think that if you will produce 10 quintals of rice or 10 quintals of wheat, and if you will pay it 9 quintal to, or suppose 8 quintal uh, to the British traders, then how much profit you will get? And if you get just 2 quintals after much labor, then will you work? No. So people didn't pay interest for the development of agriculture. The government was exploiting, as they could get more and more taxes from this. So in this way, the agriculture was ruined. The colonial perception of commercial use of resources had yielded disastrous results. During this period, uh, coinciding with the first half of 19th century, the colonial objective changed from seizing Indian commodities to seizing Indian markets. First, they seized the Indian products or Indian commodities, and after that, they seized the Indian market. In the market, their rule was they ruled the market. They could do whatever they want. They could raise the uh, they could raise the in tax, and they uh, and by this they could get more and more profit. So now let us go for this conservation aspect. It is generally argued that the age of discovery of associated maritime travel gave rise to a new way of looking at man-nature relationship. There were two kinds of major changes involved in this vision. The first related to the emergence of a view that natural environment surrounding the human society was pliable to man's desired changes. The conservation efforts initiated by the colonies were the result of a keen awareness that had developed about an impending global scarcity of timber resources. However, none of these efforts could be linked directly to any methodical efforts at organizing the resource use practices in the colonies to the objective of conservation. A serious threat to the supply of naval timber was the initial impetus for conservation. In the absence of industrial evolution, thus the environments of colonies continued to suffer. So, in colonial understanding of environment, it was guided by the process of industrialization and the necessity of controlling resources availing in the colonies. The main features of this understanding was an emphasis on the use of natural resources as commodities. So, now let us proceed for the environmental agenda. The environmental agenda of colonial and the post-colonial period in India show a striking continuity in their working doctrine. This continuity is also reflected in the underlying principles of related policies. The early attention of the English colonizers was most exclusively focused on timber among all the natural resources of India. The environmental agenda was therefore set by the English, keeping in mind the forest and its products. The objective was abundantly clear: conversion and utilization of forest timber as a commodity geared for the market. Interestingly, the forest policy pursued by the independent India too was guided by a similar, if not identical, agenda. As we know that the policies that the British had imposed on us is still going on. We are still being ruled by the 1860 Police Act and many acts that in that the Constitution of India. It is a fact that the Constitution of India is based on, or it has extracted many things from the Government of India Act 1935. So whatever policies they had made for us is still going on, and not so much changes was done to this. So colonial environmental agenda, reviewing the book Nature and the Orient in the Economic and Political Weekly, David Hardiman had written that the forest agenda of the British colonial powers was subjected to a critical inquiry in the book by protagonists arguing for and against the protest policy adopted by the British. The argument centered around the current crisis of massive deforestation, and while the forest policy of the British colonial period was held responsible for originating the current crisis, it is also contended that the same policy continued to be implemented almost seamlessly in the post-colonial period. This actually was an extension of the position taken by Ramachandra Guha in his writings dating from early 80s. So it is evident from the position taken by the protagonists as well as the opponents that colonial environmental agenda as reflected in the British forest policy in India was based on the premise that forest resources were valuable natural assets on which the state possessed absolutely property rights. The process of extensive use of wood as a forest product had begun in England earlier than an industrial revolution. But this process was hastened around mid 18th century when use of charcoal was practiced on an extensive scale as fuel to run blast furnaces. Further, orientation of revenue policy of English colonial power also resulted in the destruction of forests. The objective was to increase cultivation and thus enhance the revenue policy of the state. The agenda of English colonial power was clear as its main objective was to produce large commercial timber. The forests were ruthlessly subjected to this commercial aim. The other objective was to increase the volume of revenue collection. Forests were again treated with disdain as the act of agricultural expansion, cleared large areas of all obstructionist wooded growth. Now, in the post-colonial situation after independence, let us know what happened after independence. Analyzing the colonial environmental policy, Gadgil and Guha made a please remark if the Europeans ecological imperialism paved the way for political consolidation in India, the coalition ran the other way. Their political victory equipping the British for unprecedented intervention in the ecological and social fabric of Indian society. The Natural Forest Policy 1952 reiterates the monopolistic control by legitimizing national properties as precedence over local properties. Finally, the social groups which are intimately connected with forest do not seem to possess any long-term interest in the upkeep of forest resources. So thus the colonial environmental agenda is most aptly reflected in the management policy of the English for forest resources. The denudation of forest in England forced them to reorient forest resource use in India. Foremost change inflicted was in making forest resources a commodity for the market. This necessitated that various traditional claims on the forests were necessarily put aside. Now, let us know about the resource management, particularly of the forests, how it happened in the colonial period and in the post-colonial period, that is the independent India. Forest cover in our country has assured an alarmingly low proportion from a position of abundance in ancient times to a dismal state today. The long time span has been full of contradiction. Increased population pressure, expanding urbanization, and ever-pressing need for good standards of living and development in industrial technology have long disturbed the harmonious relationship between the man and the greens, particularly or the environment. In all description of forest resource use, there has been a tendency to see the colonial rule as an ecological watershed, the colonial rule working hand in glove with aggressive values of industrial capitalism did much damage to the native forests. Of late, the proponents of the revisionist school have sought to question such stereotypical construction, citing regional evidences. So, in this unit, we will learn about the changing pattern of resources utilization embedded in the man forest relationship over a period of time. This description will not only give us a holistic picture of utility patterns of forests as a resource, but would also enable us to locate and identify factors and processes that brought about an element of incongruity in sustainable utilization of the forest wealth. So now let us know the pre-colonial background. The period from 500 BC to 300 AD saw a big advance of agricultural land over rich uh, products. Sorry, just a minute. Yes. So the period from 500 BC to 300 AD saw a big advance of agricultural land over rich forest area both in the northern India and the river valley area, uh, and there was large availability of surplus food. Thus, the tribal chieftains started giving way to large states, Mauryas, Kusanas, and in the northern India, the Chalukyas, Sangamas, Cholas in the south India. The ground for further exploitation of forest resources lay in the logic of the empire building exercise. With technological limitations, the only viable alternative for enhancing surplus lay in bringing more land under cultivation. Of course, trade was also coming up in a big way, but then the ships and boats had to be built out of the forest road. So, another way out of incorporating other territories which called for better weapons of war. Elephants assumed significance. Forests started coming up, the number of towns increased, and the houses came up that were made of wood. So there was huge exploitation of the natural resources, particularly environmental resources, particularly forest woods and forest products. So moreover, timber had to be used for construction of furniture, crafts, chariots, wooden bridges, etc. The concept of hunting reserves also came up as hunting became a recreational activity. Chanakya says that the Brahmins should be provided forests for plantations, for religious learning, and for performance of penance. So we have seen earlier also that many philosophical treatises were written in the forests, that is the Upanishads and Aranyakas. These were forest books, and the importance of forest is further borne by the treatment it receives in Kautilya's Arthashastra. After the Mauryas, The other important empire builders were the Guptas. During the Gupta times, and more particularly later Gupta times, economy began to collapse. There was a manifest decline in trade and towns and the use of monetary system. Inscriptions belonging to this period indicated trend towards ruralization of economy and thus greater pressure on land and consequently on the forests. Amidst all these developments, forest question lost its prominence, and in the latter source, lesser attention was given to the forest. The Delhi Sultanate saw more demands being put up on the forests. The total population, both human and livestock, increased as it did the number of cities and towns. Consequently, urban population also increased. All this led to a proportionate quantitative increase in the demand for fuelwood, fruits, food, fodder, etc. Demand for quality made timber for construction of boats, bridges, houses, chariots, buildings, carts, etc. also went up considerably. On the whole, however, the forest cover did not pose any major problem to Delhi Sultanate. The importance of forest increased in Mughal India also, corresponding with the so the importance of forests increased in Mughal India, corresponding with increase in population and urbanization, as I said. And the after that, after Mughal period, we find the colonial period. The colonial period saw a qualitative shift in the man-forest relationship. For added to Indian demands were now the demands of the British Raj. Already there was demand for forest products and forest wood by the Indians. And now again the British Raj made more and more demands. With the advent of the colonial rule, an element of conscious and the ruthless exploitation begins to determine the man-forest relationship, particularly the East India Company and the latter viceroy represented in the interest of the colonial forests. For the first time, the proceeds of forest exploitation accrued to an agency which had no interest in the development of Indian subcontinent. India was systematically converted into a colony serving the interests of the mother country, serving the interests of England. The forest cover or forest resources were utilized for the need and demand of the British in England or the British people in England. The gradual establishment of political hegemony together with the development in the field of transport and communication, colonial trading practices, and industrial revolution brought about substantial change in this relationship. Forests now came to be seen as a resources to cater to the requirements of the expanding colonial and political economy. India teak featured as the permanent source of supply of durable timber for the British shipbuilding industry. So Indian teak wood has a great demand in British in England for its shipbuilding industry. It saved England during the war with Napoleon and the latter time maritime explosion. So ships were built in the dockyard in Surat and the Malabar coast, as well as the teak imported into England. The thrust of agrarian policy of the colonial state also worked to the destruction of forests. Forests were considered as an obstruction to agriculture and consequently a bar to prosperity of the empire. To enhance the agricultural revenue, cultivation had to be extended. To extend cultivation, forests had to be removed. This process was exacerbated with the development of railways after 1853. After 1853, with the establishment of railway track or the beginning of railway line, the exploitation of forest resources increased more and more. Major chunks of the forest were destroyed to ensure manufacture of railway sleepers. The sub-Himalayan forest of Garhwal and Kumaon were denuded, denuded to meet the only demand. Railways put other demand on forests as well. Before Raniganj coal mines became operational, the forests were supplied the fuel requirements of the railways. The fuel wood requirement of the railways in the northwest provinces in 1880s caused considerable deforestation in Doab. Forests in Madras region suffered wanton destruction, causing alternating cycle of foods. Sorry. The forest policy of the colonial administration worked within the overall framework of the priorities of the imperial policy. One of the foremost priorities was to generate more and more revenues for a self-supporting British rule. This logic suggested that forest products had to be marketed. The colonial rule made constant efforts to find markets for the multiple species of India's tropical forests. Urban centers required forest products for fuels, furniture, building timbers, etc. So the Himalayan forests provided bamboo, sal, and several species to confer for the urban centers of Punjab and the United Provinces and for the military cantonments and hill stations, wherever or any kind of building purposes. Wood was very much necessary, and particularly the Himalayan forests provided all these kind of forest products for the requirement of for the colonial requirement or the requirement of the colonial people. Apart from the teak export trade, trade in minor forest produce also picked up in the 20th century. Resins, turpentine, tanning materials, essential which was essential for oils and other associated non-timber forest products, had a variety of industrial applications, and foreign trade in such items showed a steady rise. The massive importance of the forest reflected itself in other ways, particularly during the two World War periods. During the First World War, the enormous amounts of timber and bamboo were exported to help British military operations in Egypt and Iraq. The Second World War was more devastating for Indian forests. India became the sole supplier of timber to the Middle East and later to the Allied forces in Iraq and Persian Gulf. So this period, during this war period or two World War period, there was huge amount of woods destroyed by the colonial requirement. On the colonial impact on the forests cannot be complete without mentioning one of its most obvious manifestations. The decimation of wildlife, you can say, by when we'll finish the forests, then where these wildlife or the animals or the jungle animals will go. Nowadays, it happens in our, it also happens with us because by the increase of this um, population, or you can say in urban centers, take for example, Bhubaneswar, the nearby forest cover is Chandaka jungle or Chandaka forest. When people, the increasing of urban population is being increased and they are moving towards and they are residing within the jungle, Chandaka jungle, then the elephants particularly are facing lots of problems. They are sometimes penetrates into human buildings or kill some people. So they create disturbances. Why it is so? When you are entering the house of a person forcefully, then the the house owner will have to leave the place. So that is why, or he will show any kind of anger, or he can beat us, or whatever steps he can take. In that way, if we will live in the jungle area, then where these animals will go? Definitely, they will come to us. They will come to our habitation. So that happened. So another, this is just an example. Another related transformation during the colonial period was the deviation of forest lands for the development of tea, coffee, and rubber plantations. These three are the profitable agricultural product. So, in order to plant these trees, coffee tree or tea or rubber. So for these plantations, uh, they the British particularly the colonial powers, they cut out the forests. The development of road and railways networks to facilitate export of tea, coffee, and rubber hastened the process of deforestation. Besides, the plantation economy itself had a high level of timber demand for fuel and packaging. The colonial state has been criticized on many other accounts as well for decline in traditional methods of forest conservation, promotion of single species tick monoculture, socio-economic and cultural marginalization uh, of tribals and other forest dwellers all went a long way in bringing element of incongruity between forest preservation and human existence. Now, man, see, if we'll take into today's example, we are not conserving or preserving the forests. We are exploiting the forests as we can do. We are ruthlessly cutting the trees, making it destructible for us. We are losing a good environment, and they will come like water bottle. We'll have to pay price for air we take. There will be air cylinder for by which we can take our breath. For breathing purpose, we have to purchase air cylinder oxygen cylinder for our purposes for living, because day by day man is destructing the environment, and it is said man is the worst destroyer of this universe. Man is a selfish animal, and it utilizes whatever it sees, and without considering the grave consequence of it, particularly the environment. As I am saying, that man is destroying the environment for industrial purpose, for living purpose, or habitation purpose, or the daily needs. We utilize, instead of planting a tree, we are cutting trees. So many of us even have not planted a single tree in our life, but we have cut or we have destructed many uh, plants or many plants in our life. So a day will come, we will have to suffer if we will not preserve or conserve these forests or the trees. Then a day will come when there will be nothing, and as I said, that there will be a time when we will have to purchase cylinder for air, or the oxygen cylinder for taking our breath. So anyway, thank you very much for listening. In the next class, we will discuss about the resource management of forest in the post-independent period. Thank you.
ସାର୍ ହ୍ୟାଲୋ
କୁହ।
ସାର୍ ମୁଁ କହିଲି ଆମେ ଏକ୍ଜାମରେ ଆନ୍ସର କେମିତି ରିପ୍ରେଜେଣ୍ଟ କରିବୁ?
ଏକ୍ସାମ ରେ ତମର କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ଯେମିତି ପଢିଥିବ ସେଇ ଅନୁସାରେ ଦବ। ତୁମେ କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ କଣ କୁହ, କୋଉ ଭଳିଆ
ନାଇଁ ସାର୍,
କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ?
ମୁଁ କହିଲି ଥିଓରି ତ ବହୁତ ଅଛି ନା, ଏତେ ଗୁଡେ ମନେ ରଖିବା ପସିବଲ ନୁହେଁ, ତ ଆମେ ଆନ୍ସର ଟାକୁ କେମିତି ରିପ୍ରେଜେଣ୍ଟ କରିବୁ ସେ ବିଷୟରେ ଟିକେ କହିବେ।
ହଁ, ଛୁଆ ଗୋଟେ କାମ କରିବ, ତମର ଦେଖ କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ କି ପ୍ୟାଟର୍ନ ପ୍ରିଭିୟସ କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ଆଣିବ, ଠିକ ଅଛି। କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ଆଣିକି ଦେଖିବ ଯେ କେମିତିକା କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ପଡୁଛି, ହେଲା। ଏବଂ
ଆଜ୍ଞା ସାର୍।
ସେଥିରେ ତୁମେ କଣ କରିବ ନା, ସେ କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ କୁ ଦେଖିଲା ପରେ ଯୋଉ ତମ ବହି ଖେଳ, ତମ ପାଖରେ ବହି ଅଛି, ଏ ବହି ସବୁ
ହଁ ସାର୍ ଅଛି।
ଅଛି ତ? ଆଚ୍ଛା, ସେଇ ଅନୁସାରେ ତମେ ସବୁ ତ ଲେଖି ପାରିବନି, କାରଣ ଆକ୍ଚୁଆଲି ତୁମକୁ ବି ଏଥିରେ ପଢେଇ ହଉନି, ସବୁ ଆମେ ପଢେଇ ପାରୁନାହୁଁ ଠିକ ସେ। ଏତି କାହିଁକି ନା ସାତଟା କ୍ଲାସ ଦିଆ ହଉଛି, ସେଥିରେ ଗୋଟେ ଜିନିଷ ରହୁଛି ପଢେଇବା ପାଇଁ, ଠିକ ଅଛି। ଯୋଉ ଆମେ ଟିକେ ଟିକେ ଜିନିଷକୁ ମାନେ ଗୋଟେ ଗୋଟେ ଚାପ୍ଟର କୁ ଯୋଉଠି ଆମେ ଦି ତିନିଟା କ୍ଲାସ ନଉ, ସେଠି ତୁମକୁ ଗଡେଇ ଯିବାକୁ ସମସ୍ତେ ବାଧ୍ୟ ହଉଥିବେ, କେବଳ ମୁଁ ନୁହେଁ, ସମସ୍ତେ ଯୋଉମାନେ ପଢଉଛନ୍ତି ତମକୁ, ଠିକ ଅଛି। ପର୍ଟିକୁଲାରଲି ଯୋଉମାନେ ଡିଷ୍ଟାନ୍ସ ରେ ପାଠ ପଢନ୍ତି, ତେଣୁ ତୁମକୁ ଟିକେ କଷ୍ଟ କରିବାକୁ ପଡିବ। ଆଉ ତମେ ଗୋଟେ କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ଯେତେବେଳେ ଲେଖୁଛ, ଟେକ୍ ଫର ଏକ୍ସାମ୍ପଲ, ଯଦି କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ପଡିଲା ତୁମର ଏଇ ଯୋଉ ଫରେଷ୍ଟ ମ୍ୟାନେଜମେଣ୍ଟ ଉପରେ, ରିସୋର୍ସ ମ୍ୟାନେଜମେଣ୍ଟ ଅଫ ଫରେଷ୍ଟ, ତ ସେଥିରେ ଯଦି ପଡିଲା, ତମେ ତାକୁ କଣ କରିବ ନା, ଏଇଟା ଦି ତିନିଟା ପଏଣ୍ଟ ସିଏ ଦେଇଛନ୍ତି, ତୁମେ ସବ ପଏଣ୍ଟ ବାହାର କରିଦବ, ଠିକ ଅଛି। ସବ ପଏଣ୍ଟ ବାହାର କରିଦେଲେ ଆମକୁ ଲେଖିବାକୁ ସୁବିଧା ହବ। ଏବଂ କଥା ହଉଛି, ଯେତେବେଳେ ଲେଖିବ ଗୋଟେ ପଏଣ୍ଟ ଅଣ୍ଡରରେ କିଛି କିଛି ଲେଖିଥିବ, ନ ଲେଖିଲେ କେହି ମାର୍କ ଦେଇପାରିବେନି, ବୁଝିଲେ। ସେଇଟା ଅନୁସାରେ ତୁମେ ଦେଖିବ ଯେ କଣ କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ଆଗେ ଦେଖ, କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ଦେଖିକି ପଚାରିଲେ ସେ ଅନୁସାରେ ଆମେ ଦେଖିବା କଣ କଣ ଲେଖିବ, କୋଉ ଜିନିଷ, ଯୋଉ ଜିନିଷକୁ ତମେ ମାନେ ତମ ପା କହିଲେ ଧର ଫରେଷ୍ଟ ମାନେ ରିସୋର୍ସ ମାନେ ଯୋଉ ଫରେଷ୍ଟ ରିସୋର୍ସ ମ୍ୟାନେଜମେଣ୍ଟ କେମିତି ହେଉଥିଲା ବ୍ରିଟିଶ ପିରିୟଡରେ, ଏବଂ ପୋଷ୍ଟ ଇଣ୍ଡିପେଣ୍ଡେଣ୍ଟ ପିରିୟଡରେ କେମିତି କଣ ହଉଥିଲା, ଠିକ ଅଛି। ଏବଂ ସବୁ ଜିନିଷ ଗୋଟେ ପାରାଗ୍ରାଫ, ଗୋଟେ ଗୋଟେ ପାରାଗ୍ରାଫକୁ ଛୋଟ ଛୋଟ ପଏଣ୍ଟ କରିପାରିବ, ସବ ପଏଣ୍ଟ କରିଦବ। କାରଣ ଯେତେବେଳେ ଜଣେ ଖାତା ଦେଖୁଛନ୍ତି, ଅନେକ ଲୋକ ବି, କାହାର ସମୟ ହଉନି, କାହାର ଧୈର୍ଯ୍ୟ, ସବୁ ଲୋକ ଠିକ ସେ ପଢନ୍ତି ବି ନାହିଁ, କିଏ କାହାର ଖାତା ଦେଖା ତରିକା ବି ଅଲଗା, ଠିକ ଅଛି। କିନ୍ତୁ मोस्ट प्रोबेबली समस्त ठीक ठाक देखंती बोली आशा करे। सो तमे जेते पाठटा लेखुछ क्लीयरली बुझिकी लेखिबो ठीक जिंस। तुमको पचरा हेतिबो तुम ना कण तुम अलगा कथा लेखिबो ସେଥିରେ ଭଲ ମାର୍କ ପାଇବ ନାହିଁ ଠିକ ଅଛି। ଆଉ କଣ କହୁଛ କୁହ ଆगे क्वेश्चन
ସାର୍
ତୁମେ ଦେଖ ପ୍ରିଭିୟସ
ନେକ୍ସଟ
ଇୟର
କ୍ଲାସ
କେମିତି କଣ
ଆସାଇନମେଣ୍ଟ କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ଗୁଡାକ ଡିସକସନ କରିଦେବେ।
क्वेश्चन ତ ମୋ ପାଖରେ ନାହିଁ ମା ଦେଖିଲି
ଅଛି ସାର୍ ଅଛି ନେକ୍ସଟ
ଆଉ
କ୍ଲାସରେ ଡିସକସ କରିଦେବେ।
ନେକ୍ସଟ କ୍ଲାସ ଆଉ ଯେତିକି ଅଛି ପଢିବ ଏଟା ତୁମର କେତେଟା କ୍ଲାସ ହେଲା ସବୁ ମିଶେଇକି?
ସାତଟା ଛଅଟା କ୍ଲାସ ହେଇଯିବ ବୋଧେ।
ଫାଷ୍ଟ କ୍ଲାସ ତ ହେଇପାରିଲା ନାହିଁ ଠିକରେ
ଛଅଟା ବୋଧେ ସେ
କାହିଁକି ନା ଏଟା ଲାଷ୍ଟ କ୍ଲାସ ଅଛି ତୁମର ଆସନ୍ତା ଇଏଟା ବୋଧେ ଛଅଟା ବୋଧେ ହେଲା ଆଜି
ଆଜ୍ଞା
ଲାଷ୍ଟ କ୍ଲାସ ଗୋଟେ ବାକି ଅଛି। ତାପରେ ସେଥିରେ ତୁ କୋର୍ସ ସାରିକି ତାପରେ କ୍वेଶ୍ଚନ ଟିକେ ଡିସକସନ କରିଦବା ହେଲା।
ଓକେ ସାର୍
ମୋର ଗୋଟେ
ଥ୍ୟାଙ୍କ ୟୁ।
ଚ୍ୟାନେଲ ବି ଅଛି ତୁମେ ଚାହିଁଲେ ଦେଖିପାରିବ ମୋ ନମ୍ବର ଲେଖି ରଖ ଯଦି ଚାହିଁବ ମୁଁ ବିଭିନ୍ନ ଇରେ ତୁମର ତା ଦେହରେ କିଛି କାମ ଦବ ତମର ସେ ପାଠରେ ମୁଁ ଜାଣିନି କୋଉ ପେପରରେ କଣ ଅଛି ମୋର ଗୋଟେ ଚ୍ୟାନେଲ ଅଛି ନମ୍ବର ଟା ଲେଖି ରଖ ମୁଁ ତୁମକୁ ପଠେଇଦେବି ଇଏଟା ଲିଙ୍କ ପଠେଇଦେବି ସବସ୍କ୍ରାଇବ କଲେ ବିଭିନ୍ନ ଜିନିଷ ଜାଣିପାରିବ ମୁଁ ସେଥିରେ କ୍ଲିୟରଲି ଲେଖୁଛି ପାଠ ଗୁଡା ଠିକ ଅଛି 985333 80 857 ତମେ ଇଗ୍ନୋର ପିଲା ବୋଲିକି ଲେଖିବ ତା ଦେହରେ ହେଲା।
ସାର୍ ଆପଣଙ୍କ ଯୋଉ ଚ୍ୟାନେଲ ନେମ ଟା କଣ କହିବେ?
ଚ୍ୟାନେଲ ନେମରେ ମିଳିପାରେ ନ ମତେ ଇଏ ପଠେଇଦବ ମୁଁ ତୁମକୁ ପଠେଇଦେବି ଲିଙ୍କଟା ଠିକ ଅଛି।
ଓକେ ଠିକ ଅଛି।
ହଉ ଥ୍ୟାଙ୍କ ୟୁ।
ସାର୍ ଥ୍ୟାଙ୍କ ୟୁ।